The Irish were among the first slaves in the Americas, sold, starved, and worked to death. Their suffering has been overshadowed, their story erased from mainstream history. But this dark chapter shaped nations in ways few realize. In this video, we uncover the brutal truth of how thousands of Irish men, women, and children were ripped from their homeland, shipped across the Atlantic, and forced into servitude under horrific conditions. A history of pain. A history of resilience. A story that must be told. Stay with me, Bright, as we journey back in time to expose one of history's most overlooked tragedies. Ireland's introduction to slavery. Ireland's connection to slavery predates the transatlantic slave trade. It began in blood and fire, centuries before European empires looked to Africa for forced labor. The first major wave of Irish enslavement started with the Viking raids in the late 8th century. In 795 AD, Norse invaders attacked the Irish coast, pillaging monastic settlements like Armagh, Clonmacnoise, and Kildare. They didn't just take gold and relics. They took people. Irish men and women were bound in chains, shoved onto Viking longships, and sold across Europe. Many were taken to Scotland, Norway, Iceland, and even as far as Constantinople, where they were ransomed, sold, or forced into backbreaking labor. But the Irish were not passive victims. In 875 AD, enslaved Irish captives in Iceland staged one of the largest slave rebellions in medieval Europe. They fought for their freedom, and though many perished, their resistance planted the first seeds of defiance. By the time the Battle of Clontarf in 1014 ended Viking dominance in Ireland, thousands of Irish slaves were freed. But freedom was short-lived. A new oppressor would soon rise, the English crown. The English conquest and forced transportation. By the 12th century, England had set its sights on Ireland. What began as military conquest soon turned into economic exploitation. Traditional slavery was abolished in Ireland by 1102, but it was replaced by serfdom, a system where Irish peasants were tied to the land, forced to work for English lords under brutal conditions. Then came the 16th and 17th centuries, a time of war, famine, and mass enslavement. During the Irish rebellions against English rule, entire villages were razed, and thousands were slaughtered. Those who survived were often sent not to prison, but into forced labor. One of the darkest moments in Irish history came under the rule of Oliver Cromwell in the 1650s. His brutal conquest of Ireland led to mass executions and mass deportations. Over 550,000 Irish men, women, and children were killed by English forces. Another 300,000 were captured and sold as slaves or indentured servants. The victims included political prisoners, defeated soldiers, and even children as young as 10 years old. England's solution to Irish resistance? Deportation. The infamous phrase, "to hell or Connaught," issued in 1654, gave the Irish a choice. Flee west of the River Shannon, where the land was barren and desolate. Be shipped across the ocean into slavery. Tens of thousands were herded like cattle onto ships bound for the Caribbean and North America, their fates sealed in iron shackles. Life in slavery. The Irish in the New World. For the Irish, exile meant an unimaginable nightmare. While some were sent as indentured servants, many were outright enslaved, especially in the Caribbean. 1. Barbados, the Irish slave colony. By 1652, at least 12,000 Irish men and women had been forcibly shipped to Barbados. They were sold at slave markets, branded like cattle, and worked to death on sugar plantations. An Irish slave cost as little as 900 pounds of cotton, making them cheaper than African slaves. The heat, overwork, and disease killed many within a few short years. 2. Montserrat, the Emerald Isle of the Caribbean. By 1637, the island of Montserrat was nearly 70% Irish. The English sent so many Irish slaves there that the island's culture became more Irish than English. Even today, Montserrat's population celebrates St. Patrick's Day, not just as a cultural holiday, but as a reminder of their ancestors' struggle. 3. North America, the forgotten laborers. Tens of thousands of Irish captives were also transported to Virginia, the Carolinas, and New England. Many were orphan children, often referred to as transported vagrants, forced into lifelong servitude. Between 1629 and 1632, entire shiploads of Irish captives were sent to Guyana, Antigua, and other British colonies, never to see Ireland again. Was it indentured servitude or slavery? Historians still debate whether the Irish were enslaved or merely indentured servants. Indentured servitude typically involved contracts, but many Irish captives had no such agreements. They were ripped from their homes, thrown onto ships, forced into lifelong labor, with no chance of return. Even if they survived their contracts, they had no rights, no money, and no land. Many remained trapped in generations of poverty, their descendants still struggling centuries later. Their stories were overshadowed by the horrors of the African slave trade, which was far larger in scale. But the Irish too knew chains, whips, and forced labor. Legacy and erasure. The Irish slave trade faded from history, its echoes buried beneath the larger transatlantic trade of Africans. But the scars remain. In Montserrat, the Irish influence endures in the island's culture, music, and traditions. In Barbados, the descendants of Irish slaves, known as redlegs, still live in poverty, their ancestors suffering long forgotten by history books. In North America, Irish laborers built roads, tilled fields, and laid the foundations of new settlements, without ever receiving the freedom or dignity they deserved. It is a story that demands to be remembered. Why this matters? The suffering of the Irish should never be erased. Their history is part of the greater human story, a story of resilience, tragedy, and survival. So what do you think? Should history acknowledge the Irish as part of the global slave trade? Let me know in the comments. Like, share, and subscribe if you believe forgotten histories should be told.